From the blood-stained soil of Tennessee to the windswept plains of New Mexico territory, a shadow moved through the American frontier, dealing death with Southern charm and an iron code of justice. In an era where survival meant keeping powder dry and aim true, Clay Allison emerged as perhaps the most enigmatic figure of the American West, a Confederate veteran-turned-rancher whose calling card read peacemaker, even as his reputation spoke of far darker deeds. On a frost-bitten morning in 1841, a child drew his first breath in Wayne County, Tennessee, a babe who would grow to cast a long and bloody shadow across the American frontier. None who witnessed young Clay Allison's early years could have divined the tempest brewing beneath his skull, a storm born of both nature and savage circumstance. The war between his ears began early, they say, when a mule's kick crushed his skull at age 9. The local sawbones did what he could, but that iron-shod hoof had already sealed a darker fate. Folk whispered about spells that would take the boy, moments when his eyes would go flat and dead as a rattler's, and his usual gentle manner would twist into something altogether more fearsome. The war between the states came howling across Tennessee like a demon wind, and young Clay, barely 20, rode hard for the Confederate cause. The 9th Tennessee Cavalry gained a soldier with dead-eye aim and a taste for close combat that made even hardened veterans step careful. But the devil's in his head. They rode with him, too. During night watches, fellow soldiers would catch him talking to shadows, his hand never far from his Colt. The Army surgeon saw it clear enough. Emotional instability they scratched onto yellowing papers with trembling hands. Those who served alongside him spoke of a man who could quote Shakespeare one moment and explode into terrifying violence the next. His discharge papers told a tale of medical unfitness, but the blood-soaked stories that followed him out of the service spoke of something far more primal. That head injury, that soft spot, as mountain folk called it, became legend in its own right. Frontier doctors who later examined Allison spoke of a depression in his skull deep enough to lay a finger in. Some claimed this void in his head left room for demons to slip in and out as they pleased. Others reckoned it explained his peculiar nature, how he could shift from courtly Southern gentleman to merciless killer quicker than a rattler's strike. The war years had forged something deadly in Clay Allison's broken skull, a particular kind of madness that seemed tailor-made for the savage poetry of the frontier. He emerged from the conflict like a ghost riding west, carrying with him a uniquely lethal philosophy. There were some folks who needed killing, and he reckoned himself just the man to do it. Those who knew him in those early post-war days spoke of a man wrestling with his own nature. In lucid moments, he'd write letters home filled with graceful penmanship and tender sentiments. But when the pressure in his skull built up, like thunder before a storm, even his closest companions learned to give him wide berth. He was known to press his palm against that cratered temple, as if physically holding back whatever demon lived in that hollow space. The injury that marked him became both curse and dark blessing in the untamed territories. In a land where violence was common as dust, Clay Allison's particular brand of madness made him something special. A killer with cause, a gentleman with a hair-trigger, a Southern cavalier whose broken skull housed both poetry and pistol smoke. As he rode west into legend, that old head injury rode with him, whispering sweet violence in his ear, turning every confrontation into a dance with death that only he could hear the music to. Some said the mule that kicked him had been Satan's own mount, placing its mark upon him like a brand. Others claimed Providence itself had cracked his skull, creating the perfect instrument for frontier justice. But all agreed that kick from a mule's hoof had birthed something unique, a killer who could quote scripture while gun smoke still curled from his barrel, a gentleman whose calling card read, "Peacemaker," in elegant script, written in the same hand that had sent so many souls to their final judgment. In the shadow-stained saloons and dust-blown streets of the New Mexico territory, Clay Allison's code of justice rang out louder than his gunshots ever did. A man who'd drift into town dressed fine as a riverboat gambler, smelling of good tobacco and speaking with the polished drawl of old Virginia gentility. But beneath that courtly manner lurked something that made even hardened outlaws study their boots and find business elsewhere. Folks said his code was simple as a hanging rope, but sharp as a snake's tooth. "I never killed a man that didn't need killing," he'd drawl, lazy as summer heat, while cleaning his fingernails with a knife that had opened more than a few throats. That declaration wasn't just words, it was gospel writ in lead and blood across the territory. The story that best captured his peculiar brand of frontier ethics unfolded one scorching afternoon in Las Vegas, New Mexico. A local tough had been beating on a Mexican boy no more than 15 summers old. While others turned their backs, Allison stepped out into the street, neat as you please in his black broadcloth coat. "Sir," he said, soft as church music, "I do believe you've mistaken yourself for a man of quality." The beating stopped right quick, but the tough made the fatal error of reaching for iron. They say Allison's draw was so fast, witnesses swore he never moved at all, just stood there while the tough toppled face first into the dirt. But it wasn't all gun smoke and violence. Clay Allison's name carried weight in business dealings, too. His cattle operations ran clean as a mountain stream. No mysterious brands, no questionable deals. When other ranchers tried running roughshod over Mexican homesteaders, Allison's word became law. A man's property is his castle, be he rich as Croesus or poor as Job. He backed those words with lead when needed, but more often his reputation alone was enough to keep the peace. That same man who'd kill without blinking would tip his hat to every lady who crossed his path, no matter their station. He'd quote Shakespeare to schoolmarms and share his last tin of peaches with trail-worn cowboys. At social gatherings, he'd dance every dance, moving light as thistledown despite the weight of 2 colts riding his hips. "The measure of a gentleman," he once said, "ain't in how he treats his equals, but in how he treats those who ain't." His justice had its own peculiar mercy, too. When a young horse thief was caught with Allison's stock, everyone expected to see rope stretch. Instead, Clay gave the terrified boy a job, saying, "Any man desperate enough to steal might just be hungry enough to work honest." That boy went on to become one of his most trusted hands. But cross that line of his, harm an innocent, break your word, or show disrespect to a lady, and Allison's genteel manner would vanish like morning mist. His eyes would go flat and dead, that old war wound in his skull seeming to throb visible, and death would come calling dressed in fine clothes and speaking in courtly tones. The territory learned to read the signs. When Clay Allison rode into town wearing his string tie and carrying his silver-mounted colt, folks knew justice was about to be served with all the refinement of a Southern gentleman and all the finality of a hangman's drop. His code became the law in places where law was still more dream than reality, dispensed with equal measures of courtesy and cold steel. Some called him the gentleman killer, others the refined regulator, but those names missed the mark. Clay Allison was something rarer, a man who'd carved out his own brand of civilization in an uncivilized land, using whatever tools came to hand. Good manners, business sense, or the cold authority of his gun. His code wasn't written in any book, but it was etched deep in the memory of every territory hard case who ever looked into those dead eyes and decided today wasn't a good day to die. While other cattle barons built their empires on borrowed money and stolen land, Clay Allison carved his kingdom out of the New Mexico dust with cold calculation and hot lead. His spread in Colfax County wasn't the biggest, wasn't even close, but every acre was paid for in coin or blood, and every head of cattle wore his brand honest. The year was 1870 when he first rode into the Cimarron country, nothing to his name but a war-weary horse, 2 colts worn smooth as sin, and a head full of dark dreams. The big outfits were already there, some running 50,000 head, their cowboys more like private armies. They figured this quiet-spoken Confederate with the dead eyes would be gone by winter. They figured wrong. Allison built slow and built sure, starting with 100 acres and a handful of Mexican cattle so wild they'd gore their own shadows. Where other ranchers hired gunmen, he was his own security. Where they blustered and threatened, he spoke soft and carried his reputation like a loaded gun. A man's word ought to be better than his bond, he'd say, and his bond ought to be good as gold in any bank from here to San Francisco. His business methods were as peculiar as the man himself. He'd ride into some hardscrabble homesteader's place, hat in hand, offering fair prices for grazing rights when other outfits were running roughshod over small holders. "Ain't no profit in making enemies," he'd drawl, "when you can make partners for the price of treating folks decent." Those same homesteaders became his eyes and ears across the territory, while other ranchers found their cattle mysteriously spooked and their water rights disputed. But make no mistake, this wasn't any Sunday school tale. When the Santa Fe ring tried muscling in on his water rights in '75, Allison showed them just how much lead a gentleman's word was worth. 3 ring enforcers rode out to his ranch one autumn morning. Only their horses came back, and even the buzzards seemed nervous about picking at what was left behind. The ring decided there might be easier pickings elsewhere. His empire grew like a prairie fire, slow and steady, then all at once. By '77, the Allison brand was known from Texas to Colorado. His cattle drives moved like military operations, with scouts riding ahead and flankers watching the shadows. Not one head was ever lost to rustlers. Some said it was because thieves respected his reputation. Others whispered it was because rustlers who crossed Clay Allison had a habit of becoming fertilizer for the spring grass. In the cattle towns, he cut a different figure than your usual ranch king. No fancy Eastern suit or diamond stick pin for him. He dressed range practical but quality, like a man who knew both the value of good gear and the futility of showing off. His business deals were sealed with a handshake and backed by cold steel. Bankers learned that his word on a loan was better than most men's collateral. The source of his success wasn't just lead and violence, though he dealt in both when needed. It was understanding that empire building in the territories required a delicate balance of fear and respect. He'd help a neighbor raise a barn one day and burn out a rustler's camp the next. He paid top dollar for good hands and treated them fair. But any man caught stealing from him learned why his reputation kept honest men awake at nights. By the time the big cattle companies started moving in with their Eastern money and corporate ways, Allison's outfit was too well established to muscle aside. His empire wasn't the biggest, but it was built on foundations of iron, personal loyalty, ruthless efficiency, and a reputation that made even Cherokee hard cases think twice about crossing his fence lines. They say empire builders need to be either feared or loved. Clay Allison managed both, ruling his piece of the territory with a peculiar mixture of Southern courtesy and calculated brutality that kept both friends and enemies wondering which face of the man they'd see next. His cattle empire stood as testament to a simple truth. Sometimes the most successful businessman is the one who knows exactly when violence is better than negotiation, and courtesy deadlier than a threat. The feuds of Clay Allison weren't the common dust-ups of drunken cowboys or the petty squabbles of range wars. They were campaigns, planned with military precision and executed with the cold efficiency of a hanging judge. Each battle in his private war shaped the territory, leaving behind legends written in blood and gun smoke that folks still whisper about in trailside camps. The Mason County War might have swallowed the whole territory if Allison hadn't played his hand like a riverboat card sharp with an ace in his sleeve. While other ranchers chose sides and reached for their rifles, Clay rode the middle line, dealing death to the worst of both factions while keeping his own interests clean as a new-minted dime. "Sometimes," he'd drawl, "the best way to win a war is to make sure both sides lose." His alliance with Sheriff William Brady raised eyebrows among those who knew Allison's general disposition toward lawmen, But there was method in this seeming madness. While other outlaws found themselves dancing at the end of Brady's rope, Clay's business interests flourished under the protection of selective law enforcement. It wasn't exactly justice, but in the territories, justice was whatever the strongest man said it was. The Clifton House shootout of '76 showed just how deep this peculiar partnership ran. When 3 hard cases from the Seven Rivers Warriors decided to try their luck against Allison's outfit, they found themselves facing not just Clay's gun, but Sheriff Brady's posse riding backup. The gunfight lasted less than 10 minutes. The Warriors lost 7 men, and the message rang out clear as a dinner bell. Clay Allison's quarrels had the full backing of the law. But it was the Chunk Lambert feud that truly cemented his reputation as a strategist of frontier violence. Charles Kennedy, a notorious troublemaker who'd been terrorizing local ranchers, made the fatal mistake of crossing Allison's interests. The following week, Kennedy's cabin mysteriously caught fire with him inside. As the flames died down, witnesses swore they saw Allison calmly rolling a cigarette by moonlight, watching the embers fade. No charges were ever filed. His methods weren't always lethal, though. When the Harrell brothers started pushing their weight around Cimarron, Clay implemented what he called his gentleman's persuasion. Instead of going in guns blazing, he systematically dismantled their operation through a combination of legal pressure, economic warfare, and the occasional midnight visit that left no evidence but plenty of nervous men looking over their shoulders. The beauty of Allison's approach was how he managed to keep his hands seemingly clean while orchestrating some of the bloodiest power plays in territorial history. He'd be attending a society dinner in Santa Fe the same night one of his rivals' operations went up in smoke. His alibis were always perfect, his witnesses always reliable, and his enemies had an unsettling habit of meeting unfortunate accidents. Even the law learned to play along. More than one marshal found it convenient to be looking the other way when Allison's brand of justice was being dispensed. As one deputy was heard to say, "Clay Allison might be a killer, but he's our killer, and he keeps the real bad elements in check." Local newspapers portrayed these feuds as simple range disputes or personal quarrels, but those who looked closer saw the careful choreography of a man who understood that power in the territories flowed from more than just a quick draw. Every move was calculated, every seemingly random act of violence a carefully placed piece in a larger game. By the time the dust settled on his last major feud in '84, Clay Allison had rewritten the rules of frontier conflict. He'd shown that victory didn't always go to the fastest gun or the biggest outfit, but to the man who could balance violence with diplomacy, strength with strategy, and know exactly when to holster his gun and when to draw it. In a land where most men lived and died by simple force, Clay Allison had turned frontier, feuding into a deadly art form. The irony of Clay Allison's end struck harder than any bullet he'd ever dodged. July 1887, under a merciless Texas sun, the man who'd faced down the deadliest guns in the territory met his match in a simple wagon wheel. No blazing shootout, no legendary last stand, just a load of supplies, a spooked team, and the weight of a heavy wagon crushing the life out of a legend. The news spread across the territory like wildfire in drought grass. In saloons from Dodge to Tombstone, hard men who'd kept their distance from Allison's deadly reputation raised glasses in quiet tribute. Even his old enemies had to admit there was something almost biblical in the way death finally caught up with him, not through violence, but through the mundane tragedy of a ranch accident. His funeral drew a crowd that would have made a governor envious. Former lawmen stood shoulder to shoulder with reformed outlaws, Mexican vaqueros next to English cattle buyers. Each had a story about the gentleman killer who'd shaped the territory's bloody transition from frontier to civilization. He was a civilizing influence, one old-timer declared, even if he did most of his civilizing from the business end of a cult. The legacy he left behind wasn't just in notches on a gun or tallies in a death book. Clay Allison had written a new chapter in the story of the American frontier, one that didn't fit neat and pretty in dime store novels. He'd shown that civilization sometimes needed men who straddled the line between law and lawlessness, between barbarism and culture, between the old ways and the new. His influence lingered like gun smoke after a firefight. The cattle trails he'd made safe continued to carry herds north. The small ranchers he'd protected kept their land when other territories saw them swallowed by cattle barons. Even the way men conducted their feuds changed. There was less random violence, more strategy, as if Allison's ghost was watching, judging whether each killing was truly necessary. The territory itself was changing by the time they laid him in the ground. Railroad tracks were stitching the wild lands together, and Eastern money was replacing frontier justice with corporate law. Some said Allison's death marked the end of an era, the last of the gentleman gunfighters giving way to a new kind of violence, one done with fountain pens and legal papers instead of six guns. But in the ranch camps and trailside fires, his legend grew like a shadow at sunset. Stories passed down spoke not just of his deadly aim or quick temper, but of his code, that peculiar mix of Southern honor and frontier pragmatism that somehow made sense of senseless violence. They'd say, he killed with reason and lived with purpose. Young guns trying to make their reputation would brag about being the next Clay Allison, but old-timers just shook their heads. They knew the truth. He hadn't been born of his time, but of the territory's needs. The West had needed someone who could quote Shakespeare while planning an ambush, who could dance at a society ball with blood still dark under his fingernails, who understood that civilization sometimes needed uncivilized men to shepherd it into being. As the frontier faded into memory and the West became tame, Clay Allison's true legacy emerged. He hadn't just been a killer with a code or a rancher with a reputation. He'd been a bridge between chaos and order, a man who understood that progress demanded both the velvet glove and the iron fist. His death marked more than the passing of another frontier legend. It signaled the end of a time when one man's sense of justice could shape the destiny of a territory. They say his grave marker reads simple: Clay Allison. Died July 3, 1887. But his real monument was the West itself, a land transformed from raw frontier to settled territory, partly through the efforts of men like him who dealt in death but dreamed of civilization. The gentleman killer's final legacy was a world that no longer needed gentleman killers.